Thank you, Selena. And so while I'm sharing my slide, I also want to thank Dr. Bauer, Dr. Sanchez, and Dr. Wang for organizing this conference and inviting me to speak to you all. This has been the work in the making for the last 2 years. I remember back in 2020, I was in Florida the day before the conference set to begin and about to fly to South Carolina, and we got stopped. I had to fly back to Canada before the country closed the border. So that was quite a memory. And I just want to thank you for organizing this conference again and having letting me have the chance to speak to you all. And for all the audience, thank you for being here on a Saturday. I hope I'm going to share my academic journey with you, and I hope you will resonate with me. And in this presentation, I also activate my the subtitles in the PowerPoint presentation. So can you confirm by putting a thumbs up, letting me know that you see the subtitle in the share screen? Great, thank you. Okay, so let's begin. In today's talk, I have 3 major goals that I want to share with you. First is that multilingualism, I see it as an interactional experience beyond a personal individual differences. And I'll share a little bit with you my language acquisition journey, and hope you will resonate with me as well. And then I would also like to share with you how languages, reading and reading difficulty intersects in the education system. Primarily, I'm going to share with you some of my work done in the United States with a glimpse of the more recent work that I did here in Canada during the pandemic. And finally, I would like to share with you my thoughts about having a partnership between cognitive neuroscience and education, and to understand multilingualism as an everyday phenomenon for all children, echoing the theme of this conference, and harmony in voices. I advocate for a transdisciplinary understanding, not only in each of their own discipline, but also listen to other discipline and see what they can inform each other. Growing up in Hong Kong, I also lived in Singapore, and during this time, I speak Cantonese and English. I also learned French at school. I understand some Mandarin, and my mother sent me to Japanese school when I was in Singapore. When it comes to language myth, my mother has experimented on me a couple of times. So growing up, there was a lot of really interesting experience that kind of informs where I am. So where I am now, I have lived in the United States for about 8 years, but before that I lived in Canada, and then now I'm coming back to Canada. And so these are all very English dominant environment that I have lived in the last many years. I'm not going to tell you how many years. And then recently in 2019, I moved to Quebec, where in Canada, even though we're a bilingual country in English and French, in Quebec is actually a French only language province. So again, I'm interrogating this socio-linguistic context and my own language journey and my own language identity. So in Quebec, what you may see as a typical business in the United States, like Staples, it's not called Staples anymore. They're called Bureau en Gros. And especially here in Montreal, we are bombarded with many different languages all the time. There's also, there's English, French, of course, and then if you go into ethnic store, you also see other languages. In my neighborhood here, we have a lot of Nepalese restaurants. And so you also have a lot of exposure to languages other than the official languages here. Currently, I can tell you my language identity is that I'm very English dominant with hopefully growing French, but not the kind of French that I learned in school. More, it's a Quebecois French. And I still use Cantonese at home, but sometimes I can't really express myself in my native language anymore. And so I also turn to English more when I communicate with my family. I still maintain some Mandarin, but I can only speak it. For some reason, when I understand it, it's maybe like 30%. I had a few projects in Brazil, so I also intended to learn Brazilian Portuguese. But at this age of my time, I just can't find enough time to learn yet another language. So here's just a personal representation of how it shapes who I am in terms of my language acquisition journey. And in this presentation, you will see that I use the term multilingualism and multilinguals throughoutly as a broad representation of how dynamic this experience is. Occasionally, I would also use terms like bilingualism or bilinguals to represent that in this case, we do have a scenario in which there are only 2 languages present. But I primarily just want to share how dynamic this experience is in terms of language. And as you heard from Selena, I have a little unusual trajectory in my professional career that I started off in psychology and continued to neuroscience, but then I ended up in education. Throughout this journey, I realized that listening is more powerful than speaking sometimes. This journey also allows me to learn a lot more from others and think about how to engage in research and community in a way that is beyond the academic communities. So as a psychologist, I can tell you that very often we say we study individual differences, we study how one person is different from another, or one group of individuals is different from another. Yet this is a research strategy that kind of limits us to think about bilingualism or multilingualism. When we talk about multilingualism and its consequences in cognition, in learning, etc., we cannot ignore the fact that multilingualism does not happen in a vacuum. It happens throughout the environment and how an individual responds to that environment. So you could say how an individual adapts to his or her linguistic environment. And this interactional differences across individuals, as you can see, it's going to be way more heterogeneous, way more broad and dynamic within a multilingual population than we have in monolingual population. But even with monolingualism, we know there are differences and variability. And so I also plan a couple of thought questions throughout the presentation here. And the first question for people from around the world is, do you know what are the languages spoken by members in your community? So you can write this down or you can think about it, and you can also put it in the chat box to let others know where you are and the languages spoken by members in your community. Now, as much as I love connecting with you on the internet, I do treasure the experience of giving in-person talks. So I looked into South Carolina a little bit. So South Carolina, it's a fairly linguistically diverse state in which you see representation of different languages, even though they're not at the highest percentage. And from the American Community Survey, you also see that these language communities also reported that they speak English very well or not. And it's a really interesting picture to when you look at South Carolina and compare to, for example, the United States average. There is a higher representation of Spanish speakers, but you also see many other languages represented in the community. Now, from the ACS, unfortunately, there's only one question about language, which asks you whether the person speaks English at home or not. And you also then asked whether if this person don't speak English at home, does this person speak English well? So those are the only questions from the American Community Survey. And I also glanced at the chat that I know there's a lot of immersion schools. So and Myrtle Beach also has a high number of Russian speakers. So I Can't wait to read the chat and follow up with you and in terms of the language diversity. So in any time when we think about research about multilinguals, we want to know where they're coming from and how their language trajectory and the daily interaction is when we look into this research. And I want to make a case that the language ecology in the environment and the way that you perceive the value of this experience is going to change how you behave. So this is part of the work coming from my former doctoral student, Sarah Serene, who is now a postdoctoral fellow at Houston. We developed a survey asking people how much they value multilingualism. So it goes like this. There are a couple of questions, and you're going to have to judge whether you strongly agree or strongly disagree with the statement. So for example, to be successful in the United States, you need to speak more than one language. And we have 319 parents fill it out who have young children. We also have a bigger sample with more representative samples across the country. And even though English is a dominant and almost de facto language in the United States, our sample is very multilingual. As you can see in this word cloud here, not only they speak English, but they also speak many other languages. And our respondents come from almost all the states, I think, except for the Dakotas. We also have responding coming from Hawaii and Alaska that you can see in the green and pink dots here in this graph that I overlaid on the community ACS census data highlighting where the language diversity is. More red area represents there are higher concentration of respondents in the census reporting that they don't speak English at home, and blue area means there are fewer. Now, if I have to make a guess, let's say people who speak English as a first language but never tried out to and claim that they are not successful. Sometimes people can be very humble. And some people reported they speak English as L1, but they also speak it L2 fluently. And also other people who don't speak English as a first language. So in a continuum, I'm trying to break the prototypical research image that we're comparing monolingual to multilingual. What we're trying to do here is to look at the gradation. And with the 4 groups here, I mean, if I were in an in-person audience, I would ask you, which group do you think value multilingualism the most? Which group do you think has a higher perceived social value of multilingualism? But since we're doing it online, I'm just going to tell you what the answer is. So the group who don't speak English as a first language value multilingualism the most. But as a psychologist, I'm most interested in this group. I'm most interested in this group because they are all the most variable. So for people who speak English as a first language and claim never try to learn a second language, their responses almost cover the entire range. And so what I'm interested in is what makes their response different from each other. And so in the American Community Survey, we can also extract a statistic called reporting the number of people speaking a non-English language in the community according to their IP addresses. So we call it the local language diversity. So from the point where the respondent responds to our survey, we want to see in their vicinity, what is the local language diversity. And it turns out that that is a very important predictor on how the group who speak English as a first language, but never try out to determine their value for bilingualism. And of course, we also control for other factors. And so we find that if for parents who had never tried to learn a non-English language and did not speak English as L1, value bilingualism the most. As you may imagine, in a community setting, you will also see that like there are different kinds of people wanting multilingualism for very different reasons. For English-speaking families, they want another language to act as an asset to a social capital. And for families who don't speak English at home, they want their children to master English because it's a de facto language in the United States. And the next most important question that we really want to ask is if this is a sample of parents with young children, so we extracted 136 of them, we want to see if their perceived value of multilingualism predicts the likelihood of when they engage with the children in their heritage language. So here's the graph where we have a couple of activities like singing songs, mealtime talk, telling a story, and reading books. And we asked them, in addition to those questions that I share with you, whether they have engaged their children in these activities in the last 2 weeks. And it turns out that the more parent value multilingualism, the more likely that the parent would also engage in these activities with their children. And this is true for singing songs and mealtime talk. The relationship is a little bit weaker for telling stories and reading books. And it turns out that for telling stories, if you don't know the story yourself, you can't really tell it in your native language. And for reading books, as some of you may have already said in the chat and throughout the conferences this morning, is that literacy in a non-English language, it's actually pretty hard to come by in local community libraries. There's more representation of Spanish materials, but if you speak a less representative heritage language, it is harder to get those material, and they're often very costly. So hopefully this project convinced you that multilingualism is an interaction experience based on the linguistic environment that you have. And for young children, it also based on how much the parent value this experience. So next, I'm going to switch gears a little bit to think about languages, reading, and reading difficulty. So as I mentioned, in research, we use group comparisons looking at multilingual and monolingual, yet they're a polarization, polar extreme of a continuum. And there is very limited resources for us to capture the colorful experience of multilingualism around the world. So very often we have to take the most extreme and ensure that the samples are different from each other in order to make a comparison. But even among the researchers, we actually don't have a very good understanding of how to define what multilingualism is. As in psychology, we know there are a couple of factors. So first, we know how early you learn a second or additional language can tell us a little bit about your language experience, how well you speak your second or even first language, because they interact with each other. And how often. So sometimes I would call, for example, my child would be someone I call weekend bilinguals because he only speaks to my mother in Cantonese when he talks to her on FaceTime over the weekend. So I call him a weekend bilinguals. And so the frequency of usage matters. Now, think about in education settings, if many of you are teachers here. In schools, there is no categorization of whether a child's multilingual or not. What instead you have is a benchmark of English proficiency. So you have students who are proficient in English versus those who are not. So here I also listed all the labels that have been used in the literature and in public documents to describe children who are in the process of acquiring English in the school systems. And if you work in the school, you will also realize that we have a population called English learners. Now, English learners are represented about 10% in the student population. In 2018, it's roughly 5 million in the United States. And in the map here, you can see the concentration of the English learners almost mirror what we see as the American Community Survey that I showed you earlier, in which some of these states are have higher concentrations of respondents saying that they don't speak English at home. And this diversity also transmitted to represented in schools, where we also see a higher concentration of students who are in the process of learning English in the southern part of the country. North Carolina stands at 70.5%, slightly lower than the national average. Sorry, South Carolina, 6%. And majority of the English learners are actually born in the United States. So they're entitled to quality education just like everybody else. Spanish, it is the most representative language, but depending on where you are, there's a lot of diversity. In some cases, Arabic may be the most representative language, and in other cases could be Haitian Creole. So there's a lot of diversity from district to district, and sometimes even from state to state. While historically these students congregate in urban elementary school, there's also a trend seeing that more of these children in suburban and also rural area with new settlements. Very often they have high dropout rate at high school because of many different reasons. And in some states that support gifted identification and education, English learners are often very rarely identified for giftedness. Many of them may come from low income background that I'll show you some statistics. And they're more likely to be identified as having specific learning disability. So that's the context that we're working with here. All of the description that I have used so far, it's more deficit oriented. And in national reports, there are very few narratives that actually see the potential of these students and the challenges that they face at school. So here I'm going to show you some ideas about how we conceptualize these type of deficit narratives. So I conducted a secondary data analysis on 2015 data set in a northeastern state. Sample size is roughly 210,000. And based on the data set, I can put them into 4 language groups. The first group, where parents reported that their first language is English. And then the 3 other groups where parents reported that the first language is not English, but they have never received English service, or they received English first but got reclassified because they reach a competency level. And the final group are represent children who are current English learners. In many of the statistics that you see in the United States, they focus on these first 3 groups because they are proficient in English compared to the last group in which the children are not proficient in English yet. And I also have to add that there's state to state and also district to district variability on how they determined English proficiency. So if I do a very simple analysis, I just want to show you a mosaic graph here, that the percentage of students is on the vertical axis and the 4 language groups that I highlighted here. And for those who speak English as a first language, roughly about 30% of them are from a low-income family, which is shaded in gray. But for current English learners, it's roughly 80%. And the other 2 multilingual groups are in between. So English proficiency, at least in the state that I got the data from, is almost completely confounded with income status. And in this case, the data set was still using the lunch status, which now been replaced by economic disadvantage. And you may say, okay, this is only grade 3. What about other grades? Maybe we only see it here. We got data from grade 3 to grade 8, and the patterns is almost identical, that English proficiency has a profound association with socio-demographic factors such as lunch status. And in this case, we also have to think about what is all this talk about an achievement gap of English learners. Is it only about their English proficiency? Is it about their learning? Or is it about other structural factors that we haven't accounted for? Historically, we also see language-related achievement gap reported in the literature. For example, Manuel in 1935 reported that Spanish-speaking children in the process attending public school in the United States have a curve that is slightly lower across ages, from 9 to 12 in both arithmetic, which is math, and reading. And in this paper, you see a term that describes how Spanish-speaking child suffers serious and persistent language handicap based on their performance. And here I want to say that that was published in 1935, and currently it's 2022, but we still hear this. So you can put it in your chat box here. Or you can put it in a reaction button. Have you heard of people saying that, oh, I'm not sure if I want my child to speak another language because that might lead to confusion or lead them to misunderstand the language. So think about this for a moment. And now I also want to show you the National Report Card on Reading back in 2019. So in 2019, which is a couple of years ago, right before the pandemic, if you look at all the documents that's available, we can look at grade 4, and the comparison is still on English learners versus not. And you also see it in grade 8. Again, there is a gap as if you look at these data, but rarely do you see that these data reported in the context of what about their socioeconomic status, what about their environment, what about their strength of their first language, where are they coming from? Now, if you want to know more about these data, Justin and Brianna will present at 12:30 in session E, in which we will look at the breakdown of these language groups and socioeconomic status in terms of academic achievement in a state exam, as well as special education identification rates. So stay tuned. Now, meanwhile, in Canada, what is going on here in Canada here, where most children are educated in 2 languages and very often multilingual? During the pandemic, we have collected data from children and teenagers, and the results are almost identical. It's a very complicated graph, but here what I want to show you is the relationship between English vocabulary and English reading are almost identical for those who speak English as a first language in this panel versus not. Yes, children who speak English with a first language have a higher level of English vocabulary, but they don't necessarily perform better in English reading. So what this data tells us is that even though English, whether it's a first language, seems to have a profound impact on how we looked at education data and, for example, reading development here in Canada, when children and teenagers are being educated in multiple languages, this effect may not be as strong. So stay tuned for more. Hopefully next time I see you, I will present the full data. Now, I have some thought questions for the researchers and educators in the audience. How are the children's home language background assessed in schools? And for researchers, how do you assess children's home language backgrounds in your studies? And are children's academic performance considered in light of the interaction between language background and other socio-demographic factors? And this is same for educators and researchers, that when we think about a narrative about a group of students, do we also consider other socio-demographic factors associated with the target experience that we want to measure? So I'm going to now switch gear a little bit to reading difficulty. I don't know if Fred Genesee is here, that we're due to present in the same session later in the afternoon, but I took this from one of the chapter that he co-wrote with other colleagues in the field. Reading difficulty implies that a child struggled to learn to read despite normal intelligence, perceptual abilities, adequate learning, and in absence of other psychological problems. And the core deficit seems to be, the struggle seems to lie in fluency, decoding, and comprehension. There's a wide range of statistical estimate, such that I just have to say there's no statistical estimate of the prevalence of reading difficulty in L2 readers, because there's a lot of statistics going on, and roughly national statistics ranges from 5 to 17%. It depends on how you calculate it and where you obtain the data. But specifically to identify statistics for prevalence of reading difficulty in L2 learners is almost non-existent. And epidemiologically speaking, if we believe that reading difficulty is due to innate medical condition, there's little reason to believe that reading difficulty rates should be higher in children with diverse language experiences. And reading difficulty can be a standalone condition, but it can also be a comorbid condition with other situations such as ADHD and other health-related conditions. In education, I'm not going to have you read through this, but in education, there is a special ed category that speaks to this ability, which is a specific learning disability. And in specific learning disability, according to the definition on NCES, it includes a lot of these things that I highlighted in red, that I'm going to read a few just to include you, give you an impression. So the terms include such conditions as perceptual disabilities, brain injury, minimal brain dysfunction, dyslexia, and developmental aphasia. So what you see here is this term is actually much broader than it is. And with a term this broad, covering almost everything under the sun, it's no wonder that in recent years that specific learning disability is the highest, the condition compared to other conditions that have the highest incidental rates. Now, in the new destination stage, this is a paper just came out with my colleagues, Jeanette Menzila-Martinez at Vanderbilt. We also looked at whether second language proficiency modulates special education risk ratio across the years from 2009 to 2019. And if you look at this graph here, the colored line represents the current English learners and English proficient bilinguals. And they are consistently lower than an identification rate compared to the native English speakers. And currently we're doing more to understand whether it's separated by grade, what is the timing of their identification. So using historical data from this date, we can answer some of those questions. And I was also interested in how socio-demographic factors impact the identification rate. And it seems like that there is a difference in native English speakers, the L1 English group, in which that if they are eligible for free or reduced lunch, and then they're less likely to be identified. But this pattern was reversed for the bilingual groups. But the consistency in how the English proficient bilinguals are always the lowest in identification rate persists across all categories, all analysis. Now, I was very interested in, along with my student, Laura Massit, who was very interested in the practice angle of these data. So we want to see how confident are educators when they assess reading difficulty in multilingual children. Some of you in the audience may be doing this as well, so I would love to hear from you. So in part of her dissertation, she recruited 980 participants who are educators. Many of them worked in identifying reading difficulty in English learners. 477 of them also conducted assessment for English learners. And very similar to national statistics, majority of the respondents are English monolingual, meaning that they don't feel comfortable speaking another language. And more importantly, I think this statistics is already oversampled because of the purpose of our study is to look at reading difficulty in multilingualism. And so I think this statistic is actually slightly lower than what is the representation of language diversity in the teacher force. So here is where I don't even have to give you the analytic data. I'm just going to show you the raw data. We asked educators to rate their level of confidence of identifying or diagnosing reading difficulty, and it ranges from 0 to 10, 10 being the most confident and 0 being not. So you can see here, well, people are pretty confident, which is great because that's what we want them to be. And then we also asked them the question, rate your level of confidence identifying or diagnosing reading difficulty in English learners. Very disappointingly, we did not expect to see this actually as scientists. Many people say they're just not confident at all. And very often they also say they are just, 50-50. And so this presents a problem because if you're not confident about the identification and diagnosis, that has cascading consequences on the services and support that these children received. So as the thought question, if you're an educator, how is reading or literacy assessed in your organization? I can see in the chat box that some of you have already started to populate. And what are the considerations for children being tested in their second or additional language? We followed those survey data up with a focus group with 20 educators, and many of them mentioned that there's a lack of multilingual assessment, such that if you speak Spanish, there might be some assessment that you could use. And for others, it's almost a guessing game. There's also a lack of representations of linguistically diverse teacher force in educators, reading specialists, and literacy coach. And very often they also raise the fact that they don't receive enough training in professional development or in on the job or in pre-service teacher training to support English learners. So that gets to my last part, which is thinking about a partnership between cognitive neuroscience and education. So far, I hope I've piqued your interest in thinking about how the burning question here is, how do we reliably identify bilingual children with reading difficulty? And how do we differentiate developing second literacy proficiency from reading difficulty? Now, my talk is not going to give you that answer. It is still a work in progress, and it is a very challenging problem. Now, why do I propose that neuroscience could be one way for us to think about this question? Very often people look at neuroscience and education as a one-way communication. They want neuroscience to provide answer to education. But the reality is that neuroscientists are not set out to answer practical question. Their studies answer a scholarly question that is stemming from a scientific vacuum. But neuroscience does tell us a lot about learning. And I think this is a rhetoric and it's a reciprocal informative discourse that we need to look into. And if we actually map it onto education as a context, we can learn a lot. And so one of the major benefits of... Can everybody hear me? I hear music and I wanted to dance, but I know I shouldn't. So I think neuroscience is one way for us to step away from making relative comparisons, like this group is performing lower than the other group in academic test, and I'll show you why. And neuroscience can also facilitate for us to understand a process or a mechanism in order to think about how can we develop strategies to ameliorate or buffer the situation. And in turn, we could formulate evidence-informed solution. But this is, again, a work in progress because it is very difficult to bring everybody together from different disciplines, fields, and professions at a table. But as I now said, this question, the partnership should be inspired by an education challenge that I raised one of them. There are many others that we can talk about. And for scientific work in neuroscience, they also need to start thinking about tasks that are more ecologically relevant and analysis that actually capture these relevance. As you may see here, I'm trying to avoid the word ecologically valid. When you are lying in a scanner that you cannot move for 45 minutes for people to take pictures of your brain, there is nothing ecologically valid about the learning that you are doing in that scanner. But we can still design ecologically relevant tasks. So in our brain, we have a couple of things that I want to share with you here. And here is an image of an MRI scanner. This is the same brand that I use. And I don't remember whether this is my brain, but this is a human brain that looks like a walnut. But you can see that there's some gray matter at the outskirt, and the majority of it is white matter. White matter is kind of like information highway that allows signals to travel fast and reliably between faraway brain regions. And the black area you see here is it has fluence, it's cerebrospinal fluid to protect our brain within our skull. So the skull is shown in the highlight white image here. In this scanner, we can learn about the brain in many different ways, one of which is to understand the general anatomical structure. We can also capture brain activity. So when you see images like this in the media or in research papers, these are not, our brain does not light up like a Christmas tree. These are actually statistical tests, and we're just mapping these statistical tests onto a voxels, which is kind of like pixel, but then it's three-dimensional. So the images is a little bit blurrier because we're now taking into fourth dimension of information, which is time. So across time, do we see activity showing up to be statistically significantly different than when we're not doing that task? And finally, we also can understand how white matter are structured in the brain. So here is an image that color-coded the direction. I don't know where the water travels from, but I know that they travels in the direction of front and back in our brain. Blue is from bottom to up, and red is left and right. Okay. So in my research, we found that if you ask an adult, at what age did you start learning your second most proficient language to account for the proficiency and usage? We see that the earlier they used the most proficient language, meaning that they use it the longest in their life, and they are also attaining a highest level of proficiency beside their first language. We see that this variation is captured with the brain structure that connects the left and right hemisphere. Now, granted, it makes sense because managing multiple languages are effortful. And if it's effortful, we may need more brain regions to help us with this task. We also found a similar relationship in younger children in adolescence, and all of these results control for other factors such as biological sex, parental education, age, and nonverbal IQ. And the pattern is almost identical, but that is shifted towards the back of the brain, which speaks to the developmental trajectory of how our brain started to develop. And the front part of the brain is the latest to develop. So we see this in adults and also in children. But what about learning new information? All I've shown you is that the earlier you speak another language, there's some shifting going on and reorganization in your brain structure. So we took a science framework in 2016 and turned it into a script that we would actually use for teachers in a science classroom. And then the teacher make a recording of a lesson that she would actually use in class. And then we sit together and discuss how do we evaluate learning from this task. And the final product is a 6.5-minute video, like what I showed you here, a narrator on one side, and we have picture on the other side. And the paradigm goes like this. We ask children, we also did it on adults just to make sure that everything works. What do they know about earth science? We ask them some particular question just to make sure that they don't know what we're going to show them. And then we put them in a scanner. And I promise you, no brains were hurt here. All heads fits into this, but I just don't know how to make this figure a little bit smaller than it should be. So they lie in a scanner, and then we play this video and have them learn about it. And they know that we're going to ask them question afterwards. So they know they have to pay attention. We also include a little eye tracking device in the scanner that is compatible, that you could put in a magnet to monitor their eyes in case they fall asleep. So they also know that. So they know that we're monitoring their eyes so that they don't fall asleep. Because when you fall asleep, nothing matters. We can't assess learning. And when they came out, we asked them a couple of questions about the video. We also asked them to share with us in a free recall, what have you learned in these videos? So here I'm going to show you the brain activations in a 3-dimensional space. So for English-speaking adolescents, so by middle school, most of them have some exposure to a foreign language or core world language classes. So we can't call them monolingual, but in a way they're very different than monolingual children. So the activations in both of the hemisphere is that there's some visual area at the back of the brain, and there's also temporal area, which governs our listening. And for Spanish English bilingual adolescents, their activation network are much more extensive. So it is effortful for them to learn this video of earth science in their second language. We also have a smaller number of English-speaking adolescents with reading difficulty. And here is, you can see their activation pattern in the brain are also different from the bilingual children. So in some areas, they have lower activation. For example, in the front part of the brain, they have lower activation, which is consistent with earlier research using a less ecologically relevant task compared to the bilinguals. And in other areas, they have more activation, such as at the back of the brain in the visual area. And my former doctoral student, who is now a postdoctoral fellow at UC Irvine, were interested in language-specific processing. So in the front part of our brain, around this area, it's called the Broca's area. She is interested in what other brain areas work with this area that is supported, that is purportedly to support syntax processing in the brain. So here I'm only going to show you the data from the English-speaking adolescents, and the correlation with activity in the Broca's area is very confined in the left hemisphere. And for the multilingual children, you can see a lot more activations with this area, meaning that there are more brain regions having correlating brain activities across time. And then she's also interested in the Wernicke's area, which governs semantic processing or word meaning. And in this case, again, you have more confined left hemisphere correlation with the activity in this area. But for the bilinguals, it's across the two hemisphere. So what these results tells us is that not only we see that earlier experience of using a second language change the structure of the brain that connects the two hemisphere. For adolescents who are learning new information in the first and second language, they also show different functional networks. And particularly for the bilingual children, Spanish, who speak Spanish as a first language, their activations are on both hemispheres. And when we say it is effortful to learn in your second language, we know what it means, but I think this is the very first evidence to demonstrate that when you have an ecologically valid task, that you can see the activation going through both hemispheres. If you're interested, this is a paper that Sibylla published, also shows that in the eye tracking movement, we found something similar. And the selling point of this paper is that we know that knowing syntax in Spanish in the first language, it's going to help reading in English. So there's not a seesaw phenomenon that if you're proficient in your first language, then you are lower in your second language. As a summary, I want to highlight that multilingualism has different meanings across countries and across settings within countries. Multilingualism also presents an interaction between an individual and her environment. The intersection of multilingualism, reading, and reading difficulty reflects a realistic practical challenge in education. And multilingual experience is associated with differences in brain structure and activation when learning new language in a second or additional language. Practical implication is that support for multilingual learners should begin with a community goal that is sensitive and equitable for all students. And often bilingual children are put in a silo or as a special case, but in fact they're not. Many research studies have shown that bilingual children or multilingual learners and monolingual learners share similar developmental path. And so we have to take that into consideration. And for children who speak a minority language, learning in a majority language is already an immersion education for them. So when we think about bilingual education program, we also have to think about whether we have the community, whether it's appropriate for the community and not just going off to have an immersion program. And I can tell you more about this from my experience visiting Ecuador. Intervention or pedagogy is not entirely different for multilingual learners, and this is not going to capture more resources in a school setting, but the importance is to focus on what they need and design and give them the support that fits into their need and not think about trying something new and start a new wheel. And a lot of the times, the linguistic challenges is only one side of the coin, and there's a linguistic asset that you have seen in Carmen's talk earlier today that we should leverage, and we have to leverage in order to have these children to showcase what they are capable of. And diversity, again, should not only be recognized in statistics, but also embraced into strategic education planning, responding to the community needs. So as a conclusion, I strongly advocate for promoting the knowledge of process, which facilitate understanding of student group who show similar outcomes. Even if a district or the school does not collect this type of information, teachers can still do in a classroom. Cognitive neuroscience is not the silver bullet, because what we need is all parties to sit together and collaborate. And it pushes the discourse beyond relative comparison of behavior, because there's no better or worse brain. Your brain is a brain. You have higher activation, you have lower activation, but there is no characterization of whether a brain is good or bad. Understanding process allow educators to identify areas to improve that shape and enrich pedagogies and support for all learners. So where do we go from here? At least in my role, I see that understanding multilingualism as an individual and interactional experiences would inform not only the scholarly literature in brain function structures and behavior, but also allow us to refine these findings in a more responsive sociolinguistic context. And in turn, I'm hoping to work with educators to think about what are the linguistically sensitive, pedagogical, and community support that we could offer. And I strongly advocate for building bridges across discipline and not only focus on a discipline to practice unidirectional communication. And this is necessary because from the census, we see that from 1980 to 2010, newer statistics should come out soon, I hope. The census reported that there's almost a 200% increase in people reporting speaking a language other than English at home. So this is a situation where we cannot ignore and say, okay, let's deal with it later. No, the time is changing. The change is happening right now, and we need to take into action now. If you can only remember one thing from this talk, remember this diagram, that multilingualism, it's not only an individual differences, but also an interactional differences. And I would like to thank my team, both in Harvard Graduate School of Education and currently at McGill, for all the work that they put in to make all these findings happen. Thank you.